Good evening, everybody. Move this up a little bit. Thank you for coming out. So tonight's presentation is actually a synthesis of a presentation I gave in January at Peninsula College in an exhibit that went into the Peninsula College Longhouse for the last 6 months that Bonnie just mentioned we moved into the library. I would encourage you all to take a look. Later on, I'll be showing you a couple artifacts from the site, but these are the ones that didn't make it in the exhibit, so if you want to see their cooler, shinier cousins, go across the street. The booklet that you have in your seat is a synthesis of the presentation and materials that are in the exhibit that weren't actually in the presentation, and some additional research that I pulled together since the initial presentation. I'm going to talk for roughly an hour, and then I plan on taking a break at 6:30, and when I come back, we'll start talking more about the artifacts and archaeology. To start with, I want to spend an hour talking about a bit about sort of a timeline and the ethnography that we know about the village. So thank you for coming to a glimpse of sh-ch-kwíyəŋ. Uh-oh. Helps if I turn it on. There we go. So this is a map showing slalom villages here on the north coast of the Olympic Peninsula and then around the Salish Sea area. There's my little button. And the village sh-ch-kwíyəŋ that we're talking about is right here at the star at Washington Harbor, right across the bay. To get you a bit better idea of what we're talking about, this is sort of our local area with some village sites that I've mapped out. These weren't all contemporaneous. Number 4 would be the ancestral site of sh-ch-kwung, which was the ancestral village of the Jamestown S'Klallam. And we don't have a specific location for that village. It was most likely the village that I'll mention in a few minutes. Another slide was shelled in 1828 by the Hudson Bay Company ship Cadborough and destroyed. At that point, it may have been rebuilt in this location, or it might have moved over to where number 3 is, which was a village called sh-ch-kwung, which meant muddy place, and was on the mud flat on the floodplain right at the entrance to the river. There was another village here on Klein Spit, a small village, and then a large S'Klallam village on the bluff overlooking the river. Number 5 is Jamestown. This is its S'Klallam name, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. But what we're talking about today is Washington Harbor. There's also the camp on Keopop Point, which I'll talk a little bit about later. The green marks are actually camp and resource gathering sites. So over here at the base of the spit, you had a whale lookout. The S'Klallam, the Dungeness S'Klallam, were not active whalers like the macaw. They didn't go out actively hunting whales. However, they kept a lookout at this position, and if whales came by, it was sort of opportunistic. Everybody would hop in canoes and go out and hunt the whale. Number 2, Dungeness Spit. There were camps out there various times for resource harvesting purposes, and then for a couple decades around late 19th, early 20th century, tribal citizens actually lived there for a while when they were pushed out of the Dungeness village. Protection Island was also another important resource gathering site that I'll talk about later from ethnographic records. Number 7 was, there was another S'Klallam village over on Discovery Bay. And number 5, and this kind of ties into my next map, focusing on Squim Bay, some of the areas of significance associated with this village. So you have the actual village area here on Buggy Spit, the associated uplands. Gibson Spit actually up here was a burial area, and then Travis Spit and Keopop Point out here. I'll talk about later, there was at one point a village on the end on Keopop Point, and this was also where the duck nets were set up. Pitship Point, where John Wayne Marina is actually one of the oldest shell middens on the Olympic Peninsula. We know from dating that roughly I won't say demise of this village, we don't really know what happened. People quit living there roughly around the time that this village expanded in size. So there's probably some sort of an ancestral connection there. that we're not clear on. Unfortunately, the archaeology for Pitchip Point is almost entirely gone with the construction of the marina. Jimmy Come Lately, I'll talk about later. There's some ethnographic sources that talk about the chief from sh-ch-kwíyəŋ owning the fish rights to the fish weir on Jimmy Come Lately Creek right down here. We also have records of the women coming down here to gather berries on a big burned out berry patch. And over the last 2 years, as the tribe has begun work in developing the casino resort, we've done archaeological surveys that have uncovered archaeological sites that around Dean Creek that match up with what we would expect. There would be a camp associated with that fish trap, a seasonal camp. Interestingly enough, so in this area, there's 3 sites down in this area that are probably associated with that. One's a shell midden, it's pretty obvious what was going on there. One is along the creek and sort of just a mixture, it's very disturbed, but a mixture of faunal animal bones and shell, probably a campsite along the creek. And then over by the highway is actually a very old prehistoric site that they've dated to at least a couple thousand years old. So this area has been used for thousands of years, which I just think is cool because we're down here every day. This was, when I originally gave the presentation, this boring slide was all the way at the end, but it was something that I wanted to dive into early to sort of talk about where I pull a lot of this information from and what the limitations of that data are. All of the artifacts, except for one, that are on exhibit in the library and that I have here today come from excavations, emergency excavations done in 1981 that were published in this report in 1984. They came about, and I'll talk about this a bit later, during the excavation of a pipeline and excavating the back piles out of that. So a lot of the archaeological data that I give you that's not dependent on what I did the last 2 years cataloging comes from that report. A lot of the ethnographic material that I'm going to present comes from Erna Gunther's S'Klallam ethnography. Erna Gunther was a student of Franz Boas, who was sort of the pioneer of modern anthropology. And her specialty was ethnobotany. Her works are still consulted today. She was an expert on that sort of stuff. But she did a lot of ethnographic work with Coast Salish tribes in the Makah in this area. In 1925, she published S'Klallam folk tales, and then in 1927 published S'Klallam ethnography. And it was published in the UW Anthropological Journal. And what's really cool that has all sort of come about since I started this presentation research, I kind of just happened upon in our digital collections here scanned copy of her field notebooks. And unfortunately, her handwriting is just god-awful, and it's very bad scans. But I have a woman who is formerly a grant specialist here at the tribe who's actually a professional forensic scriptologist or something like that, who's going through those right now and transcribing them for me. Unfortunately, she's only gotten through her working bibliography so far, so I can only give you little tidbits and nuggets of that information. But what blows my mind in skimming through and the things I do take away from it is, for as much great data as in her ethnography, there's 10 times more in her field notebooks. And so that's something that we're going to be digging into over the next year and hopefully find out some really cool stuff. Myron Eales was the initial Indian agent out here for the Puget Sound Strait tribes. He was based on the Skokomish Reservation and mainly interacted with that tribe, but he did periodically come up here and visit the S'Klallam. And he was very influential in the founding of Jamestown. That's another story for another day. But as part of his work, he wrote 10 years of missionary work among the Indians of Skokomish, which actually covered the S'Klallam as well. And he also in 1880 did a survey of all of the S'Klallam peoples, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Some of these are other just historic sources that I pulled information from. This is an archaeological report from the Squim Bypass project, and I'm going to talk about the Squim Bypass site a little bit. But basically where Squim Avenue crosses the highway was, before the highway was there, a huge archaeological site that was basically a seasonal camp for hunters who would come to Sequim Prairie. They were on a terrace overlooking the prairie. And I believe, and I'll present a little bit of information tonight, that site was probably associated with this village. And I'll show you how the archaeological information shows a bit of that connection. So enough of the boring sources. I'm going to start by going through a timeline and sort of building a picture of when the people of sh-ch-kwíyəŋ were living, what was going on around them at that time. And once I get through the timeline, that's when we'll take a break, and then I'm going to come back and talk about the archaeology a bit. So starting at the very beginning, the earliest proven site we have in this area is the Manus Mastodon site, which was a mastodon butchered sometime around 12,000 years ago in Happy Valley, which is right about the time that the last ice was disappearing from this area. At that time, the sea level was a lot lower than it was now, and actually all of Squim Bay probably would have been an empty valley with a little lake in the bottom. So that kind of gives you an idea how different things were then. There would have been no trees. It was tundra. By 2,700 years ago to about 1,000 years ago is when dating from that Sequim bypass site puts intensive usage of the Sequim Prairie. That said, that doesn't mean that they stopped using the Sequim Prairie around 1000 BC or CE. That just means that was the latest date from that site. There's probably other camps out there with later dates, or probably at that site. 200 BCE is actually the earliest radiocarbon date from Pitship Point, where John Wayne Marina is. So that just goes to show you that midden is 2,000 years old. And when they originally recorded it, I'll talk about this guy, Harlan Smith, who came through in the early 1900s. And that midden was meters thick. That was a very old village site. Around 1300 is the earliest radiocarbon date taken from sh-ch-kwíyəŋ. That was taken from Hearth in the basal sands of the midden. So basically they excavated a test pit as far down as they could find evidence of cultural activities. At the bottom was a fire pit, and that's where they got carbon for the date. So that date probably represents the earliest occupation of that site as a seasonal camp that gradually built up with human activities and the establishment of a midden. 1400 to 1700s, we know from absolute dating that was the primary period of occupation of Pitship Point, where John Wayne Marina is. So you can see these villages definitely overlapped for a long period of time. In 1790, Kemper reaches the Strait of Juan de Fuca. He erected a cross on the bluff somewhere in the area of Gray's Marsh, north of Port Williams. That's probably fallen into the ocean a long time ago. In 1792, George Vancouver enters the strait and makes a stop here in Dungeness Bay, Sequim Bay area. One of the things that he notes out here on Travis Spit are duck poles, which he also notices over at Indian Island. Duck poles were essentially on the spit. The S'Klallam would erect about a 90-foot tall pole, usually a fir or cedar, that was braced, and then between each pair of these poles they would draw up a huge net. And when the ducks come in seasonally, they had different ways of doing it, but basically you scare the ducks into the net and you bring the net down and collect your ducks. And in ethnographic records, there was one species of duck, and I can't remember the name, it's the tiniest one. That was the one that could escape, but they could catch pretty much any other bird species out there. And when we were cataloging, we did see a lot of bird bone from this site. So that was definitely a big resource for them. Vancouver also noted that they paddled in here. They noticed there were huge numbers of waterfowl in Sequim Bay. So they paddled in they rode in on their little rowboats with their blunderbusses and shotguns to shoot some ducks. And the ducks always stayed just far enough away. So the ducks were obviously under active hunting pressure. The other thing that he noticed was that the S'Klallam inhabitants of Sequim Bay were utterly indifferent to their ship and to their guns. So even though he was here as early as 1792, there was probably previous interactions between the S'Klallam and Europeans that we just don't have records of. In 1828, the Hudson the Hudson Bay Company ship Cadborough fired upon and destroyed sx̑čkｗíyəŋ, which I mentioned earlier was closer to the mouth of the Dungeness. And I just mentioned that because, even though that didn't directly impact sh-ch-kwung, it would have had an impact on the general history of the village. In 1844, Charles Wilkes was a member of the U.S. exploring expedition, and he drafted maps all over this area, and I actually have the copy of the 1844 map here of Bud's Harbor. And so his map is very generalized. He doesn't map specific structures. He just kind of notes where they are. So I think this is more of this isn't representative of the physical structure and what it looked like. This is representative of just there was a longhouse structure there. And he uses that symbol. You can see here, closer to the Dungeness, he maps another village, probably sx̑čkｗíyəŋ or its successor, that he misidentifies as a Classett or Macaw village. But he uses this same symbol on the map to represent a longhouse. Keep forgetting I got to point that way. So 1851 was when the first white settlers showed up on, they actually started settling Dungeness Prairie, closer to Dungeness Bay instead of Sequim Prairie. In 1855, the Treaty of Point No Point was signed by roughly 50 S'Klallam chiefs and sub-chiefs, including those from sh-ch-kwung. In 1870, Edward Curtis records an account of the final potlatch, and that's in that booklet, and it's a really great read. In 1870, he also, that's the year that the U.S. Coast Survey occurred, and they created these T-sheets. These are the earliest and most accurate shoreline maps available for this area. And what's great about these is they actually went into really good detail on mapping out structures. And when I go back to that sketch of the village that was on the opening slide, this longhouse structure that I've highlighted in red matches that exact structure. Interestingly, and I will, actually I need to get out my notes because this is where I'm going to start going off track. This is where I got into Erna Gunther's field notebook and things got really cool. So one thing that in my time here, this is something that I don't think many anthropologists cover, and I haven't been able to find, is sort of the transition from a three-tier society of slaves, commoners, and nobles to, by the 1880s, that class separation didn't necessarily exist. And interestingly, in Erna Gunther's column Ethnography, she doesn't include any information about that. But when I dived into her field notebooks, she starts talking about a conversation with an informant named Robert Collier, who is an ancestor of the Jamestown Collier family, who spoke about in his grandfather's time. So this would have been roughly when that sketch of the village was made, 1840s, 1850s. The lower class, the village was split. The commoners and nobles lived in this village, that's this longhouse structure that had a palisade around it, and the slaves actually lived in a separate village at the base of Buggy Spit up here. What was interesting to me is she noted that by Robert Collier's grandfather's time, that stockade, so roughly by the 1870s, that stockade had disappeared. The classes had mixed. Before that, the classes were of comparable size. So at its height, this was probably a village of 300 to 400 people. Unfortunately, by the time Erna Gunther interviewed her informants in the 1920s, and their recollections were of the village in the 1880s, and I'll talk about that on my next slide. By that time, the village just had 40 people left. So in talking about the limitations of what we can pull from Erna Gunther's work, you have to understand that the data that she was pulling was sort of the last remnants of this vast wealth of knowledge and information that was lost with that population. So luckily, we're very lucky that she was able to capture what she did. And that kind of ties perfectly in my next slide. In 1871, the Wachir arrives infected with smallpox. They threw garments off of the boat and A guy from the village picked him up on the beach, put the garments on, and infected the entire village. That was when you saw that rapid population decline. By the time Myron Eales did his census in 1880, that's when he gives the number of 40 individuals left in the village. So you can imagine what that would do to the social structure of any group of human beings to lose 90% of your population in less than 15 years. In 1874, S'Klallam families under the leadership of James Balch, who was the chief of the Dungeness S'Klallam, pulled together gold coin and purchased 210 acres of land, which they then apportioned into lots based on how much each family contributed, and that's what became Jamestown. Some of the families, and this, I think in 1874, most of the initial families were from the Dungeness S'Klallam. Then some of the families, like the Dick Hunter Halls, who actually moved from the village of sh-ch-kwung to Jamestown, probably in the mid to late 1870s. This is really cool. So the sketch that I had at the beginning, this is originally from a newspaper I've been able to track down sometime in the 1840s to 1850s. I think it said the title was Indian Village at Washington Harbor, 1845 to 1850. I haven't been able to track down the original, but if any of you have heard of Harriet Fish, who used to be a local historian, she has a book called Tracks, Tales, and Trails of S'Klallam County, and she has her own copy of the sketch, which I wish I had known before I did this by hand. It would have saved me a little while. So what's great is this is the structure of the village in the mid-1800s. Erna Gunther's informants gave her a house-by-house description of the village in the 1880s. This is cedar. The village didn't fall down and reappear in the same number of buildings in 30 years. The village that she's referring to house by house is the village that we have in the sketch. So it's really cool that we can start home by home and review which families lived in which. And so it's kind of counterintuitive because it says it starts at the west end of the village. The west end of the village is actually to the right because that's set the farthest back into the bluff. The bluff runs north to south, and this kind of wraps out eastward. So I'm not sure why they didn't describe it north to south. Anyways, we won't go down that road. Her descriptions include a lot more information, including the number of hearths in a given house, family groups, and some additional data. I just pulled in basic information on the families. One of the things that I took away from her information in a lot of these bigger homes where you have one, maybe two families, these houses actually had 5 or 6 hearth features in them. So these houses were built for expanded family units of probably 20 to 50 people could fit in some of these homes. Again, by the 1880s, when these informants were relaying their experiences, the population had diminished. So number 1, Jimmy Lahash and his wife. Number 2, John the Doctor, his wife and 3 children. John the Doctor was one of the final shaman for the S'Klallam people prior to the influx of the Indian Shaker Church, the establishment of the Indian Shaker Church at Jamestown. House 3, Lahash, father of Jimmy in House 1, his wife, 2 unmarried sons, his mother-in-law, and her husband, full house. Tommy Mike in House 4, with he's the brother of the wife in House 2. House 5 is House 5 is sh-ch-kwung Stone and his wife, and also a very old woman, sh-ch-kwíyəŋ, whose affiliations could not be secured. So I liked that little quote. Nobody really knew who she was. The potlatch house, which is this giant structure you see here, belonged to sh-ch-kwung, the final chief of the village, and his 2 wives. I'll talk about this when I go to the next slide in the timeline, but he passed away in 1875, and nobody really stepped into that role of chief. And that probably had something to do with the fact that people were moving to Jamestown at the time that he passed away, and so things were shifting in that direction. One of the things that I'm waiting on with the transcriptions of Erna Gunther's field notebooks is she has a genealogy of this chief that we've never seen before, so that'll be really cool to see. Number 7, Squim Dick and his wife, who was Charlene and Jorine's ancestor. House 8, Squim Mike, brother of Tommy Mike in House 4, his wife, 2 sons, stepson with his wife and mother-in-law. Number 9, Squim Jim and his sister, her husband and their grandmother, and House 10, unoccupied. So you can see they're still maintaining the traditional expanded family structure, but at this point, you know, I really wish I'd included those descriptions now that I have time to talk about it. When I first gave this presentation, it was in 50 minutes, and the second time was in 30 minutes, so this is the first time I actually get to talk about everything. But I would definitely recommend, if any of you are that interested in it, and to look into Erna Gunther's column ethnography, and it's a really cool look into the village. Going back to the timeline, so that last map that I showed you was 1870. 1914 is the next accurate one that I can find, at which point the village is gone, the buggy cannery has been established, and the village has moved over to Keopop Point. 1880, I mentioned earlier, was when Myron Eales gave the population as 40. And I found this excerpt from a newspaper in 1877 that actually says a few, usually a dozen to 20 natives lived there. Myron Eales is probably a more correct number because he did his count during winter when people would be in the winter village. This was in the middle of summer when people would be out at fish camps or clam gathering or wouldn't necessarily be at the village. 1885 was the death of the chief, by which point, you know, half of the families had already moved to Jamestown, and a lot of them were already living over here in the village on Keopop Point. 1894, the majority of the remaining families moved to Jamestown. There were still a handful of S'Klallam living on the property when Hans Buggy purchased it in 1899. Hans first purchased Port Williams and established a dock there and a mercantile trading post, and then there was already a small cannery at Washington Harbor, and there was Indian housing to the south, basically seasonal housing from what I've been able to determine. It's really unclear on what actually happened to that village structure, so we'll never really know. But 1907 was when Harlan Smith first came through. Technically he was an archaeologist, really he was a grave robber. He went around and dug up graves, removed stuff, and sent it all to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And when I say remains, I mean hundreds of remains. He visited sites, a lot of those village sites that were on that map around the Dungeness area. He visited those, recorded those. By the time he visited Washington Harbor in 1907, that structure is gone and there's just a giant mid in there. Hans Buggy, and I'll show this in some photos, Hans Buggy built worker housing for the S'Klallam workers who still lived on the site, and it was actually basically the traditional shed-style small longhouse structure that was divided into apartments for the workers, which is really rare for somebody in that time to sort of accept that there were natives there already and just incorporate them into the new mixed community. Unfortunately, that didn't happen at a lot of other villages where you saw the village simply get burned and the native people driven out. 1920s is when Erna Gunther researches and writes her S'Klallam ethnography. So this is this is actually the cannery itself looking south. So we're way down there at the bottom of Squim Bay. And this was the S'Klallam worker housing that would have been noted like here on this picture. And you can see it's that, like I said, traditional shed-style structure. In all honesty, a lot of this wood was probably salvaged from that village, and it was simply reconstructed into that building. This I made a research trip over to the S'Klallam County Historical Society, and they had this really ambiguous, cool little photo of a wooden log cabin. This is, I'm pretty sure, West Squim Bay Road running towards Squim. This is at the top of the bluff. And basically this just says S'Klallam family house, 1964. So there were S'Klallam living in a house at the top of the bluff in 1964. I'm not sure exactly who that was, and I'm still trying to figure that out. But that's one of my future research projects. A lot of the descendants of that original, that community detailed in 1880 continue to live and work at the cannery, including Frank Hall, Tom and Alice Lowe, Frank Lawrence, Martin Hunter and his son David, Martha and Robert Collier, and Mary Hall Hunter. And a lot of these, you recognize the names, they were informants for either Erna Gunther's report, or their descendants were informants for the archaeological report in 1984. Additionally, and I thought this was really interesting, it was in a newspaper article, a lot of the S'Klallam from Jamestown worked here seasonally. They camped on the former village site. So I just thought that was a cool little tidbit. And then this is that Indian village that's noted on the 1940 county map. And I've got another picture I'll show you. There's some shacks out here, and as well as a few structures up this way. How am I doing on time? Okay. 1966, Buggy sells the Washington Harbor property to Battelle for the construction of the Marine Research Laboratory. There were still S'Klallam residents on the property at that time that were relocated to Jamestown. These buildings were burnt around that time. And this is a close-up of some of those structures. You can already see they're pretty dilapidated and falling down. This is probably in the late 50s, early 60s. But interesting, there's no way to be sure, but I'm pretty sure these are canoes that you can see in this photo. So I just thought that was cool. In 1972, the site was listed on the Washington Heritage Register, which you would hope would have stopped what happened next. In 1981, despite the fact that there were proper policies and procedures supposedly in place to avoid destroying the archaeological site, they excavated a giant trench right through the middle of it to put in a pipeline. And a gentleman by the name of Joe Waterhouse, who worked for the S'Klallam Tribe in Cultural Resources, stepped in, raised some flags, which generated emergency salvage excavations in 1981. Those artifacts were collected by Astrito Nat and her crew, and then she later gave them to the tribe, and I spent the last 2 summers in our tiny little archaeological vault with a couple interns cataloging all of those artifacts. And so after the break, I'll talk a bit about what we found there. In 2006, one of my predecessors, tribal elder Kathy Duncan, repatriated 390 sets of human remains and 28 associated funerary objects from AMNH in New York. Many of those remains came from the village site. Unfortunately, with the lack of documentation with a lot of them, it wasn't exactly clear where, but we at least know that they came from around the village. As Battelle continues to do different projects, they periodically have to do cultural resource surveys prior to any projects that could disturb the ground. In 2015, they conducted excavations on Travis Spit. Oh, that is incorrect. That's supposed to say Buggy Spit. Excavations on Buggy Spit, which is the little spit that points directly north into Washington Harbor. And interesting, out on that spit, they found additional evidence of food preparation and processing of large animals like elk. And that's very important for when I dive into what we found in cataloging the artifacts. Elk was very, very important for this village site. And thus in turn, so is the Sequim Prairie. In 2017, they conducted emergency excavations as part of a water line repair. The water line that they put in 1980 broke, so they went back in to repair it, and you can actually see, this is a photo from that excavation a year ago. So this gray soil is the disturbed fill that was put in. This is the trench where that water line went. This black soil is the midden. Midden soil is dark black with organic matter because the calcium carbonate in shell preserves organic matter, faunal bones, that sort of stuff. So a lot of sites in the Pacific Northwest, we have lithic artifacts, stone artifacts, but we can't come up with dates because the soil is so acidic that any bones or anything like that disappears within a few hundred years. In the case of shell middens, because you have that calcium carbonate, it actually preserves all of that organic matter, so you can get dating, you can get a lot more information. And this was very important because a lot of the conclusions of previous archaeology done here is basically stating, this is concrete, this is under a parking lot. This midden is so disturbed, there's nothing left intact of the village, and it has no real value of an archaeological site. BS, it's there. It's just buried under a couple feet of fill. I'm going to go ahead and actually take the break a little bit early before I dive into this stuff, and then when we get back, I will get into the archaeology, because this makes a good segue. So thanks. We'll be back in like 5 minutes. Okay. So to jump back into it, I gave you a timeline to kind of talk about what was going on around that time, historically and spatially in this area, and now I'm going to get a bit more into the archaeology and the ethnographic records of resource usage in this area. And I'm putting on gloves because I'm picking up artifacts, not because I'm weird. So to the right is a map that was created for part of a report done for the tribe back in the 1990s that examined what the early Dungeness area around Contact looked like prior to all of the changes that came with development and agriculture. So you can see there were actually a couple different prairies, and this data is based off of GLO maps and the land survey, the surveys that the land office would do. And so they would basically walk transects, and they would note, okay, this far in, the trees stop and the prairie starts, this far in, the trees start again, tree stop, prairie. So this data is basically compiled from transects across this area. So this is roughly representative of where those prairies are in their size, but not the exact definition of their boundaries. You can see that you have a couple different environments going on, and most of the Bell Creek Valley at that time was wetland going into salt marsh. The Sequim Prairie was noted by early pioneer settlers. In spring, this time of year, it was this beautiful prairie covered with camas and flowers. By midsummer, it was totally dry and brown. It's all sandy, gravelly loam that drains out really well, and being in the rain shadow and not getting rain for 2 months of the year, essentially everything in the middle of the prairie would die. But the seasonality of the resources available, not just for humans in terms of camas, lily, and other traditionally gathered plants, elk and deer, that's a huge resource for them as well. So you would have had seasonal influxes of the elk herds into Sequim Prairie to eat all of those things. So I think it's kind of ironic when you read all this stuff in the news now about how the elk were always in the mountains and they just wandered out into the farms over the last 30 years, and we should shoot them all because they're eating the grass. They were here a long time ago, and when I talk about the archaeology, we have a lot of elk bone. The prairie was probably burned seasonally. That could have occurred naturally at times, but you don't get much lightning here. We know that it was intentionally burned because the early recorded accounts we have of pioneers and explorers walking through the prairie, in a naturally formed prairie as a result of a forest fire or something, You'll have the prairie in the middle, and then you kind of sort of a transition zone around the edges as Douglas fir and other trees encroach, alder, Douglas fir encroach. So you have, shorter trees moving into bigger trees until you get to mature forest. In terms of the Dungeness and Sequim Prairie, the early accounts where you're walking through prairie, and suddenly you're in old growth forest. The only way that happens is if you're constantly maintaining that prairie with fire. Those old growth trees aren't going to, and especially old growth Douglas fir, they're not very susceptible to fire damage, especially not a seasonal grass fire. So this is the current range of the Squim elk herd, but I don't think it's a hard argument to make that prior to the huge influx of human population here, this range was probably transitioned northward. The winter range was probably centered around the prairies, and the winter range was in the foothills. And as more and more people have moved into this area, we've pushed the elk out. But I'm not an elk biologist. These are some great maps from that same report that I mentioned that just kind of show some of the environmental changes that were going on from the 1800s to 1900s. So you can see even by 1855, Sequim Prairie was already being settled. You had homes, and this is actually an excerpt from a very long, interesting article where a guy started at Discovery Bay and basically followed the shoreline all the way to Port Angeles and S'Klallam Bay and described S'Klallam County and what it was like in the late 1800s to encourage people to move there. And his section about Sequim Prairie talks about there is very little good land that is vacant in the vicinity of this prairie except grazing land. And the rest of that quote is, what good grazing land there is was around the margins of the prairie. So, in the middle of the prairie, especially during the dry season, you're going to have dry, dead grass. But when you have that large old growth forest around the margins of the prairie, you're going to have some form of grass growing there. The prairie continued to exist as a physical area. The prairie ceased to exist as a native prairie probably by the 1890s. And the main reasons were cows and pigs. Pigs love tubers, camas, lilies, plants like that. They gobble them up, and the cows clean up whatever's left. You also had, with the huge influx of dairy farms in this area, a lot of those farmers would bring in specific grass seed that were Eurasian grass seeds, non-native grass seeds that were used to feed livestock. Alfalfa, Timothy hay, think of things like that. Those are very competitive plants that push out native grasses. This is just kind of looking more specifically into the area of Washington Harbor. Hans Buggy built a road that connected Port Williams and Washington Harbor, and that was there at least until the probably 1930s, 1940s, as best as I can tell, or at least remnants of the little bridge that connected that. And if you walk out on Gibson Spit, that's still just kind of a dirt two-track that you can see. So by 1954, your U.S. Geologic Survey maps, you can see the structures at Washington Harbor, and there's one little shack left out there on Travis Spit. 1981 excavation, so I kind of gave you a short rundown of that. But this map shows this is west, east, south, north. The village structure would have stretched across this way, and so this trench was essentially excavated right across the village. The dirt that was excavated from that trench was then piled up into these back dirt piles, which were then screened. So that means a couple of things. The data that we can infer from the artifacts that were excavated in this manner is limited because there's no geospatial information on what layers those artifacts came from, how far down they were, if they were associated with a hearth feature, a fire pit or something else. That said, and I'll show you in the next slide, we can get basic ideas from the numbers of certain types of bone, the species that we identify there, We can get some information. Within this large trench, they observed 2 large hearth areas, which were probably within a single house. And then the test pit, which was actually excavated over here, went down to a small hearth, which was where that 650 years before present date came from. The total number of artifacts processed over the last 2 summers was, actually it's gone up since 6,590, but you get the idea. There was a lot of stuff. This is where things got cool. So I gave this presentation in January at Peninsula College, and then the folks at Battelle asked me to come over and give a shorter version of this presentation during their lunch break one day. So I rapid fired through this entire thing in 30 minutes, and then we went out and walked around the site, and I kind of talked about it. And I had been out there a handful of times before, but every time I had been there is at high tide, and this is the high tide lines. There's almost no beach at high tide. We went out there at low tide, and jackpot, from the 1984 report, they noted that there weren't any actual structural remains observed. However, a series of 7 cedar half-circle posts, approximately 20 centimeters in diameter, were observed eroding on the beach in front of the undisturbed midden. The posts were evenly spaced at 1.2 meter intervals. At one end, 2 of the posts appear to form a corner. At first, it was considered remains of historic pilings. These posts are now considered the eroding remains of the cedar puncheon stockade around the villages described by Gunther. The part that really ticked me off is that's the one part the sketch didn't cover, is that end of the village. But what's cool is, so the cedar puncheons wrap into the bluff, and I'll show you in a picture, the midden starts over here and follows the bluff over to where the actual lab starts in the parking lot. So they wrap in, there's an obvious corner, and then you actually have this second row of posts, which confused me until I came back and looked at this picture and realized that there's actually 2 gates to the village. There was one over here to the north, and this is probably related to that southern gate. Yeah, it was pretty amazing to find that. And so next time the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory's archaeologist comes out, we're going to go out there and record the locations of these posts. The faunal assemblage, basically the types of animals that we recovered. So count. You can't infer a lot from count simply because of the way it's done. I won't get too much into that. But one thing that you can really take away from this compared to other shell middens, obviously a shell midden, you're going to expect to see a lot more shell, which we didn't necessarily see. That's not to say that the shell wasn't there. It just wasn't in the area where they excavated from. The other big thing was the amount of mammal bone. Shell midden, you will usually have some mammal bone, deer, at times elk, marine mammals, seal, porpoise, that sort of thing. But they're usually sort of an accessory to fish and mollusks. Here, they were very much a primary component of their diet. Not only their diet, and the majority of the mammal bone is elk. Not only was it hugely important for their diet, elk and deer antler provided a lot of their tools, and I'll pull into those in a second. There's a lot of different types of harpoon points, and interestingly, each kind has its own unique barb style. And they think that this was basically a maker's mark. You know, if 2 people are throwing a spear at the same seal and one spear kills the seal, who do you figure out who killed it? Well, you pull out the point and you can determine by how that point was carved. We have a lot of toggled harpoon points, a large quantity of antler remains compared to other sites. And this is directly from the report. People living at this site specialized in the use of cervus, which is the genus of deer, and to a lesser degree, elk, and to a lesser degree otocoileus, which is black-tailed deer, and antler from both. And here, so I have some photos of some of these artifacts, and actually a lot of these are on exhibit over in the library, and I brought a couple more with, get back to the mic. I brought some more with me tonight if you guys are interested in coming up after. There's some really cool elk antler wedges, and in the exhibit we have the core. So if you've ever seen an elk rack, it's a huge thing. And you've got the core, which is the really thick base at the bottom from which all of the tines come. And so they would systematically hack off one tine after another, and you end up with just this hacked up core, which we have one on exhibit over there, which is really, really cool. Another important tool source was bird bone, which provides really tiny, skinny, sharp bones for use as awls and needles and that sort of thing. And just a lot of different bone points that would have been used commonly. Clicker. This is a lot. You can infer actually a lot more information from the total weight. So again, in terms of mammal bone, elk is the vast majority of it. Sea lion actually represents a large proportion of weight in grams, and that's actually very unusual for this area. Sea lion wasn't, as far as we know, intentionally or intensively hunted. So that's something that's actually unique to this site. And having worked here, maybe there were sea lions a lot more back in the day. I don't see them in Squim Bay very often, so I imagine that probably relates to hunting out on Protection Island or somewhere out in the strait. Seal was represented. We have wolf and dog remains. We have black bear, black-tailed deer, porpoise, cougar, otter, skunk. You name it, if it was out here, they were probably going to eat it. Interestingly enough, and this is something that's in the booklet and I cover in the exhibit, this village had an origin myth, basically that they were descended from wolves. And this is a common origin story as you move farther north along the coast and get up into tribes like northern Vancouver Island and the Queen Charlotte, the Haida Gwaii. So it's the only representation of that origin story within the S'Klallam people. What I thought was interesting about that is we actually, and it's on exhibit over in the library, we have a wolf mandible. So somebody killed a wolf. These are sketches actually from Vancouver's diaries of those duck poles themselves. I believe this sketch was done over by Indian Island looking down Killisset Harbor towards Mount Rainier. I believe this is somewhere over by our area, but it doesn't actually match up. I think they took some artistic license with it does kind of, I think they maybe combined elements of a couple different places. But this is from Gunther's ethnography, where she talks about how duck hunting was carried out in the marshes, out on sand spits or from canoes, on the sand spit, here on Travis Spit, on Dungeness Spit, and over on the spit on, it's now Rat Island, it's no longer a spit, off of Indian Island. There were these poles. 40 feet high, erected and held firmly to the ground by wooden braces. Vancouver says 90 feet high, so either they were taller or he was a bit of an exaggerator. At Washington Harbor, there were 12 poles, 2 for each house, which is interesting. So this gets back into that traditional rights holding and a family holding rights to certain resources. So obviously, if you're going to go out and put in all of the effort into building this massive structure for your, and then God knows how long it would take to weave a net that's going to go between 2 40-foot tall poles. If you're going to exert all of that effort, obviously you're going to want the right to go back there and return to that area and continue to harvest those resources. The net was made of nettle twine. that they pulled up using a cord that went over the top of the poles. Early morning and just before dark, they would go out and wait for a flock of ducks to fly into the nets. Ducks aren't very smart. And they would get so tangled they couldn't escape. So the sprig-tailed ducks, those are the ones I mentioned, they were so small they could wiggle through the nets. And then they wring the necks of the ducks as they take them out. This is from, these are quotes that I actually pulled out of the working bibliography of Erna Gunther's field notebooks. So except for maybe a handful of researchers, you guys are probably the first people to read a lot of this stuff. The Washington Harbor people fished for dog salmon in a creek near Blinn, Jimmy-come-lately Creek. The chief owns the trap at the mouth of the creek. It has no pocket, just two rows of webbing with a door in the downstream row. On the Dungeness, you had a much more elaborate, you actually had multiple fish traps that were much more elaborate, but this is pretty typical on a small stream of this size that just had 2 or 3 fish runs. And again, I mentioned earlier, and Gunther talks a little bit about burning a burned patch down here and gathering berries, the native trailing blackberries. Cook's grandfather, this is one of her informants, Cook's grandfather used to lay a trap of cedar limb rope in her other thing, she says a noose, tied to a log on the beach out here at Protection Island, and then he would actually circle around in his canoe and scare the seals off of the beach, and when they jumped off the beach into the water, the noose would go around their neck, and that was how he caught seals. He would then hit them with the club. So that's something that she didn't include in her S'Klallam ethnography, and she actually didn't include really any information on Protection Island other than to say that the women went out there to gather eggs. So that's one thing that I think when we actually get the transcriptions of her field notebook, we're going to find out a lot about what was going on over at Protection Island. Protection Island would have also been another native prairie. It still is a native prairie, and so would have been used for gathering in that regard. When herring come into Washington Harbor, so into the actual lagoon, the people cross the bay so as to be inside the spit. I have trouble determining if they actually mean Travis Spit or if they mean Gibson Spit. To me, with a herring run, it would make more sense for that to be in that shallow lagoon and they crossed over to Gibson Spit. Either way, to be inside the spit when the fish congregate to spawn, they get salmon at the same time because they come to feed on the herring. We talked earlier about the fish trap at Jimmy-come-lately Creek and the great burn patch with no underbrush, with having an abundance of blackberries. That patch didn't magically burn itself every year to keep the berries growing. That was intentional. Which is kind of unfortunate now because it's all a Himalayan blackberry that's just totally overtaken. So we talked a bit about the mammal assemblage. We'll talk a little bit about shell artifacts. Even though there was a limited amount of shell collected, this is pretty typical of a shell-midden butter clam. It's a big clam, doesn't taste bad, provides a lot of nutrition. That's going to be your a primary resource. Little necks, cockles, California mussels, limpets, sea snails, all relatively common in this area. Could have been gathered anywhere in Squim Bay, Protection Island, Discovery Bay. One thing that they did not collect because there were so many sea urchin spines that they represented entire lenses within that trench. So they were eating so many sea urchin spines that it was leaving piles of them inches thick behind. So we only have like 4 sea urchin spines, but that was hugely important for them as a food resource. California mussel is not, as far as I know, typically found anywhere in this area. That's a coastal species, but California mussel shells were used for like spear points, sharp razor blade edges. It had a high utility usage as a tool. Historic period artifacts. So I didn't include a ton of information on these simply because it's really impossible to determine which of historic period artifacts actually relate to life in the village versus the buggy cannery or other later developments. However, there was some interesting information there. There's a large number of, not a large number, quite a few porcelain fragments, and this is one of my favorite things on exhibit from the historic period. There's some really beautiful pieces of Japanese porcelain that are actually from a Japanese immigrant community that was at the cannery roughly around 1900, 1901. But we have hardly any information about how long that community existed, what its size was, anything like that. I included this photo, which was in the 1924 report, simply because I don't know where this photo was taken. The collection that it's cited to come from, the E.O. Gustavsen collection, as far as I can tell, doesn't exist, and I don't know who E.O. Gustavsen is. But we have, I don't know if it's this exact coffee can, but it's the exact same type on exhibit over there in the library. So I thought that was really interesting. And their conclusions were basically that if you look at the time frame of when these artifacts came from, it's an occupation of 1890s to 1930s. So roughly the arrival of Hans Bugge and the establishment of the cannery, with a heavier emphasis on the early 1900s when the cannery was at its height of operations. And then a few artifacts that may have been discarded as early as the 1850s and 60s. Those would have been trade items acquired by the tribal citizens living in the village. So, some potential future research projects that this has sort of prompted me to start looking into. One thing, we have the 64 bags of artifacts that were excavated last year as part of that emergency water line repair. That was about a week after Joey Hall, who's a tribal citizen and my intern last summer, we spent all summer cataloging the last of the Washington Harbor stuff. And about 2 weeks after I was done, the archaeologist from PNNL gave me a call and said, "Hey, I've got some artifacts for you to come pick up." He said a few, and I showed up, and I've never heard few mean 64 bags. So that's my next 2 summers. And out of that excavated materials, there's a couple things we're going to potentially look at. Maybe getting some additional radiocarbon dates would be really great. Especially because this was another controlled excavation, so we know exactly how deep things were coming from, where they came from. I am in consultation with the PNNL archaeologist about a pet project he's working on, examining function of fire-modified rocks. Traditional S'Klallam cooking was basically you take rocks, you throw them in the fire, you heat them up till they're red hot, and then you either have a basket, a watertight basket full of water that you drop those rocks into until the water comes to a boil, or you dig a pit in the sand and you put those red hot rocks in the pit, you put the food on top, you bury it, and then you uncover it in an hour or 2 or whatever your prescribed cooking time is later, and it's steamed. When you do that over and over and over again and use the same rocks, those rocks are subjected to thermonuclear stress, and eventually they crack. And once you know what to look for, you can walk out around any shell midden, and beaches are littered with this stuff simply because of how much cooking was going on. So Doug, who's the archaeologist, he thinks that using X-ray fluorescence, in layman's terms, they zap the rock with a laser beam, they can examine what sort of function that rock was used, what it was used to cook. So it'll be interesting to see how that can benefit treaty rights and just add on to what we already know about their ways of life. Tribal publication, that's what you're sitting on. And for tribal citizens in the audience, we're going to be mailing those out to each tribal household this week as well. So keep an eye on your mailbox. You get an extra copy. And one thing that I would like to do is get this site listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In the Squim area, there's 14 sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and none of them have anything to do with the S'Klallam people. And that's something that we're going to change. So keep posted on that. For anybody who's interested in more photos and information on artifacts, you can look at our online museum, tribalmuseum.jamestowntribe.org, where we have a couple dozen photos of other artifacts from the site. So, special thanks to everybody on my list. And I want to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Who's first? In the back.
Do you know how they erected the duck poles?
How they
How they
no. And that's one of the things in the accounts. I haven't read anything about them burying them into the ground. So as best as I can determine, they must have just stuck it in the ground, and I'm sure had a couple people pulling on a rope with those braces. That would be my best guess, and then stuck in the counter braces once they had it up. But I'm not an expert. Oh, sorry. Oh, repeat the question. Yes. Yes, sorry, in the back.
It looked like in that picture there was a post and then you saw the bracing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you had bracing at the bottom. I think he was asking how they put them up, and I'm not sure. I would be interested in learning that. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about in social structure, there were slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Where did they get? Are they enemies?
Slaves were taken in raids from other tribes. So the reason that village had a stockade around it in the 1840s was, especially in the first half of the 1800s, you had a lot of intertribal conflicts going on, especially between tribes in the Salish Sea and Puget Sound area and those of northern Vancouver Island and farther north. So the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, a lot of those groups would raid down here for slaves. The S'Klallam commonly raided the Cowichan and some of those other tribes going up into the Gulf of Georgia for slaves. So that was part of, and this gets into anthropology and all this, so I'm not going to dive into. But going out to raid for slaves was a common way of building one's wealth and prestige. And so when you would return from a slave raid, you didn't keep those slaves. Those slaves would then be traded on farther away from their home village to prevent escape, and those slaves were traded for wealth. So those slaves, there's no way of knowing, where they would have come in from individually, but probably tribes to the north, or maybe, down at the south end of Puget Sound. Next, yes, ma'am.
What happened to the human remains that were recovered?
What happened to the human remains that were recovered? The human remains were reburied in the Jamestown S'Klallam Tribal Cemetery in 2006. And we have an ancestral reburial plot where we do all of our ancestral reburials, and so they have a marker within there that notes that they're from Squim Bay. Yeah. Next, yes, sir.
What is your estimate of the total population in this area?
I couldn't tell you in the area. The best current guesses for what population was around like the first influx of white settlers is probably around 2,000 to 3,000. That would have been split between probably 24 villages along the coast of the Olympic Peninsula and then a few upriver systems. In this area, the village at Dungeness was the largest, and there's no way of knowing it, the time of first contact and even the early 1800s what the population of that village was. We know that by the 1860s, the Dungeness village was almost 1,000 people. It was very large, and that S'Klallam from a lot of satellite villages and smaller communities were moving into that Dungeness village. So that's as much as I can tell you. Next. Yes, sir.
Seminoles came from Florida?
Yes.
That's where you were doing your work down there?
Yeah, I was working in...
What type of work?
Similar and different. We were working in middens. Our middens were out in the middle of the Everglades. So it was it was similar and different. We're on little tree islands out in the middle of the swamp that had the middens, lots of mosquitoes. I love being out here. Nothing wants to bite me or chew on me or sting me. It's great. Doing archaeology in the big cypress swamp in the Everglades is a great thing to do for 2 or 3 years and then transition away from it. I'm very impressed with people who commit to that as a career choice long term. Yes, yeah.
The human remains, was there any evidence of body modification?
So the question was, with the human remains, was there any evidence of body modification? And yes. So the 1984 excavation report, actually, one of the other things that prompted those excavations was discovery of human remains in that project area, and that was an elderly woman who had had her skull flattened. And so that's something that in any given S'Klallam burial ground, the nobles would have had their heads flattened, so you do see that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Just a speculation, I know that at least further out on the coast, the heavy logs were raised for long hoses by building cribs and jacking them up that way. And I'm wondering about those poles, if they were to, at a balance point, build a high enough crib that you could lever it up on that.
Mm-hmm.
Just speculating.
I have no idea. What's interesting is some of George Vancouver's speculations on what the hell those poles were for, because they weren't out there hunting ducks. So he was trying to guess, you know. And then he got over to Indian Island, and that was when he found there were skulls on 14-foot tall poles, and then he had all of these weird theories. It's always funny to read that. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why did the Hudson Bay Company fire on that one?
Why did the Hudson Bay Company fire on the village? Oh, I could give a whole presentation on that. To sum up, the Hudson Bay Company had agents working all through Puget Sound, Salish Sea area. At one point, one of their agents, Alexander Mackenzie, was headed from Fort Vancouver up north to, is that Fort Langley that's up there by Vancouver, BC? He arrived at Port Gamble with 2 or 3 other Hudson Bay Company employees and asked for some S'Klallam guys to paddle them in canoes over to Victoria. So 2 young S'Klallam guys said, yeah, we'll do it for pay. Jumped in the canoe, paddled them over, and were treated like crap the entire time. The S'Klallam guys returned to their village. Mackenzie refused to pay them. So the S'Klallam guys returned to their village. Mackenzie on his way back, and there's a whole bizarre, when Mackenzie was first at the village, he and his guys jokingly around just killed a dog for fun. Said, hey, we're gonna have this for dinner, and killed a dog and then skinned it and left it there. So there was odd things going on there. So Mackenzie and his party came back through Port Gamble, and when the tribe requested payment, they said, no, these young guys didn't do what we asked them to, they were awful, yada yada, we're not paying you, said a lot of really bad things, and then left. And so the tribe kind of got together after that and said, hey, you know, what are we gonna do about this? So they hunted Mackenzie and his party down and killed him. And they took his, he had an Indian wife, they took her captive, and she was held at the village at Dungeness. So the Hudson Bay Company set out another agent on a punitive mission, and he actually came with a party of men overland from Fort Vancouver. And then they attacked a longhouse at Oak Bay over on the other side of the portage from Port Hadlock. They attacked a house full of 6 S'Klallam, killed 2 men, a woman, and 3 children there. Got back in their boat, came around to the Dungeness village, began negotiations with 2 chiefs from the Dungeness village on the return of that woman, because they didn't understand or have any interest in understanding how these deliberations customarily and traditionally took place. They they did something that made the chiefs feel threatened, so the chiefs jumped in their canoe and started paddling away from the boat. They shot both of them and opened fire on the village, destroyed, I think, 30 or 40 canoes. Yeah, so long story short. And there's a lot more detail into it. There was a gentleman who worked for the Hudson Bay Company. His last name was Ermatinger, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, who kept a really interesting account of the entire thing because he was not a higher up, he was not an officer, and he did not like the officers or sort of their way of going about things. So you get a very interesting look in, the majority of it had to do with the agent that the Hudson Bay Company sent up, and he was a very weak-willed and cowardly man, and that was 1828, yeah. So, next question. Yes, ma'am.
So at that time, wouldn't they have been using more of the Chinook jargon? Like the people that were trying, like maybe the communication had to do with not understanding what they were telling you.
Yeah. So the question was, would they have been using Chinook jargon? I'm sure they probably were, and there was some communication that did occur. I think it wasn't so much verbal communication as body language and posturing. And in the accounts, before the ship even opened fire, there was a previous encounter of where they almost opened fire, and the captain ran up from his cabin and said, "No, what the hell are you doing? You don't just open fire on the village." And then a couple days later, guess what happened? So there is definitely a breakdown in communication. I don't know if that was lingual or how that occurred. But Chinook jargon was definitely being used out here. That Bud's Harbor map from 1844 has Kiapot Point named as that, and that's a Chinook jargon word. So if Chinook jargon was already being commonly used in the 1840s to refer to a lot of place names out here, I would assume that it was probably in the common vernacular at the time.
What
Yes,
does
sir.
Kiapot mean?
It means thin needle or point. So it's like needle point. Makes a lot of sense. Yes?
You mentioned when the slaves were taken, they were traded away, but were they ever rolled into the tribe, or they always kept a slave?
That is a loaded question that I could not answer even if I wanted to. And so that's one of the things that really interested me in that little snippet that I took from the field notebook is a lot of that transitional period and what happened to that stratified society. The Northwest Coast is very unique in that you have hunter-gatherer societies that are stratified. The accepted model of a traditional hunter-gatherer society is an egalitarian society with certain specialists within the group, versus here in the Northwest Coast, you had that tiered society, but at the same time, you didn't have a political system. It was a wealth-structured system. And so there were ways for commoners to acquire wealth and become noble as to whether there were when he talks about in the notebook, when he says the different classes were incorporated with each other in his grandfather's time, does that mean intermarriage? You know what I mean? It's kind of hard to figure out what was happening there, but I think if you look at other things that were going on at that period of time with epidemics and internecine tribal conflicts, you see the population rapidly diminishing, and I think you get to a point there where, they noted that the upper class village was the same size as the slave village. How long can you maintain that relationship when, maybe the population of one has dropped to 50, and you know what I mean? So I don't know, but it would be very interesting to find out. And there are a lot of factors involved in that. Yeah. So, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that there was evidence of how the
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because in my brain I was like, no, you know what? I skipped that one when I was on that slide. And that was one of the reasons why I actually included, let's get there. Oh, sorry. Anne? Hi, Anne. So Anne asked, I mentioned earlier the connection between the Washington Harbor Village and the Squim bypass site, or the prairie, and what that connection was. And so my theory on that connection is, if you look at this map that's compiled from sources in the mid-1800s, the first roads, it's the same road that's there today that connects Washington Harbor to Squim. The trail followed that exact path. And so I think, that would have been the traditional trail that connected those two. That's one other thing that I'm interested in personally in future research. And that's something that I have to clear with the Jamestown Cultural Committee and stuff, because it would involve destructive analysis. But seeing if there's ways to look at the genetics of the elk remains recovered at Washington Harbor and those recovered at the Squim bypass site, and see what that genetic relationship is. And then additionally, if anybody's killed an elk out here in like the last 20 years and you want to give me one of those bones too, we'll figure out if they're related to them. So that's, it's just a theory, but I think, the fact that so there's a couple different roads on this map. The earliest noted is 1855, which are the long dashes. And so you can see there's actually one from Washington Harbor to Sequim Prairie. There's actually another one from Sequim Prairie actually to this other prairie, another from Sequim Prairie out here. Those were probably traditional trails that connected those prairies long before white settlers ever showed up here. And those trails probably connected to the trail systems that we know exist in the Olympics. When I said that there's limitations to Erna Gunther's information, one of the things that always tickles me in her ethnography is she talks about how the S'Klallam never used the mountains or went into them. They were impenetrable. The alpine area of the Olympic Mountains, they might as well just classify it as one massive archaeological site once you get over 4,000 feet. I mean, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of archaeological sites going back thousands of years. These mountains have been used for thousands of years. The people who were here 150 years ago are still using them. And those trail systems probably all connected. And those trail systems probably morphed into the early logging trails and logging roads that you see going into the park and the mining roads. Those would have followed the same general paths, marked with culturally modified trees, most likely. Yes, ma'am.
On the Sequim Prairie, you were saying that white people started coming in around 1851. How did I know the native people of the S'Klallam set up Jamestown, but how did they secure, or did they secure, places on Sequim Prairie where their traditional food production and gathering occurred?
So the question was, how did the tribes secure the ability to gather traditionally on Sequim Prairie? They didn't. This gets into treaty dynamics, but treaties never gave the tribes a right to anything. They reserved rights that the tribes have had for thousands of years. Unfortunately, despite the fact that all those people signed the treaty, those rights weren't explicitly spelled out. And so when it comes to the land grabs, especially the Donation Act in the mid to late 1800s, prairie is prime real estate, and especially once you have irrigation ditches in there to get grass growing year-round. But so they didn't. One of the things that interested me, and that was why I'll see if I can go back and find it, I included that small quote from a newspaper that talks about, and I think I want to pull it back because I don't remember exactly what year. I'm going the whole way through this thing. So there's an excerpt from the newspaper, I must have skipped it somewhere, that talks about, in the, I think it was 1870s, the original settling population on Sequim Prairie. Where is this? Oh my goodness. Here. God, I went right past it. It was on the original slide. These settlers are a mixture of Native Americans and foreigners. So in 1880, you have this, you would have had a series of farms around Sequim Prairie, and some of those were Native Americans. I don't know specifically what families those are, but obviously at that point, they're not in the native people aren't interested in acquiring land on the prairie for traditional gathering. They're acquiring land on the prairie to farm, to engage in dairy and agricultural practices that were brought here. And I think that's because by 1880, all of those native, or the majority of those native plants were probably gone. It would have only taken pigs a couple years to just totally destroy that. So no, those rights were never secured. Other questions?
Well, it just brings up the point also that Native Americans could well be married to foreigners in 1880.
No, yeah, absolutely, and that occurred a lot as well. Yeah. Other questions? Neil.
You were showing those antler harpoon points, and you had a toggle.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What's that for?
So, a toggled harpoon is basically, so you think you have your little spear, and a toggled harpoon is fastened on the end of it, but it moves. And so when you stab that into an animal and you pull it back, it lodges sideways so it doesn't pull out. Additionally, if you do pull out, you're just losing your harpoon point and you're not losing the entire spear or harpoon. So that's what a toggled harpoon point is. And there are different harpoon points used for different species, and that's something that I haven't really dived into what these were meant for, but I'd be interested in learning. Other questions? I've talked myself out. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.